Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Darius Watson, and I am the Unlikely Professor. My goal with these videos is to try to break down complex issues in society today to easily digestible frameworks that we all consider in our own way. I am not here to try and tell anybody what to think. Hopefully, however, I will help you develop stronger frameworks so that how you think leads you to better conclusions and understandings of the world around you. Ultimately, I will try and keep these videos under 15 minutes, but as I am a professor and like to hear myself talk, that probably won't always be the case. So when we're talking about critical race theory, it is important to understand that it begins with a basic theoretical framework called critical theory or postmodernism. Critical theory and postmodernism in many ways find their basis in the leftist, even Marxist or communist ideologies of the Cold War. With the defeat of the Soviet Union and communism in particular, many of those critical frameworks that were used to understand class dynamics within society as part of Marxism transformed and evolved into a more universal and applicable framework that we now understand to be postmodernism and critical theory. So when you understand or try to understand critical race theory, it's important that you begin with an understanding of the theoretical framework that it comes from. The first assumption of critical theory is that all meaning is socially constructed. It doesn't mean that reality doesn't exist. There are facts, but it means that the meanings and value of those facts are determined through social construction or the interaction of individual human beings to the point that they compromise or agree upon a single or set of meanings and values for a particular concept. So relative to the idea of race, it is important to understand that there is no scientifically provable basis upon which to use race to categorize and then, more importantly, create different values for different races. The idea from social Darwinism to eugenics, the idea of using science to prove not just racial difference, but racial hierarchy has been debunked continuously over the last few generations. The second assumption of critical theory is that not only are these meanings socially constructed, again, created by interactions between individuals who come to agreement upon the meaning and value of concepts. Social construction is also done at the behest of those in power. In other words, the more power you have, the more able you are to shape those meanings and thus the values of those meanings. For the average realist, the ability to enforce a law represents the definition of power, the ability to enforce your will on another. For the critical theorist, it is the ability to create the meaning and definition of things around you that is the true power within a society. And it is with this thought that we then engage the issue of critical race theory. So critical race theory is taking critical theory and applying it specifically to the issue of race within America. And just like critical theory, critical race theory has some specific assumptions that it begins with. First, race as we understand in America is a result of social construction. One of the foundations of racism in America is an assumption that black and white are somehow inherent objective truths that we've all been working to try and integrate and combine over time. Critical theory would argue that the very understanding of what not just white and black are, but the very concept of race has been socially constructed. What's important, and this is leading to assumption number two, is that the construction of race and in particular black identity within the United States has been done by those in power, i.e. whites. And the relationship between white power in the systems of the United States through history and the evolution and development of both white and black identity have been done with the goal of creating supremacy or dominance for the white race. That's the key argument here for critical race theory, is that to understand US history, you have to understand the interactions between white and black definitions of their racial characteristics, and specifically how those definitions were then used to create discriminatory systems that continue to affect America today. And that leads us to assumption number three. History is not just history. African Americans are not upset over things and symbols like the Confederate flag simply because we're looking for reasons to be upset. From the critical race perspective, discrimination going back to the origins of slavery, i.e., the 1619 Project, all have influences throughout US history, including social, economic, and political inequalities in America today. So it is important from a critical race theory perspective to understand how control and development of narratives throughout American history have led to and enforced systems of discrimination against African Americans. So that's the sum total. I need to be as clear as possible that it is a much more complex and dynamic approach to social theory and American politics that I'm presenting here. But again, the goal is just try and put this in a perspective that everyone can easily digest and then consider on their own. So the next question then becomes, why are so many threatened by critical race theory? So first and foremost, as much as the media has focused specifically on white conservative reactions to critical race theory, the reality is that critical race theory also calls into question some of the perspectives within the Black community. Specifically, it is the argument that certain aspects of the Black community or Black culture that profess to try and improve themselves by adopting certain cultural characteristics, certain norms and behaviors that are associated with success or progress in America. The argument from the CRT supporters is that there are plenty of people within the African American community who, in fact, have been at least complicit in promoting certain aspects of the racist systems and narratives within American culture through their adoption of certain aspects of whiteness in America as aspects of progress and success. And so it's important to understand that this aspect of critical race theory, it is not directly targeted at white Americans. In fact, it is targeted at the development of race as a concept within America and how that development then led to distinct inequalities and discrimination that we can see and trace through the entirety of history of the United States. And the key is that the critical race theory arguments that it is possible for both blacks and whites to either directly or indirectly promote some of these racist narratives. And for African Americans and some liberal white anti-racists, the argument would be that they're doing that by attempting to civilize, continue to attempt to civilize or offer aspects of civilization to the African American community that inherently mean they need to become whiter in order to become more civilized. Now, obviously, the primary focus of critical race theory, at least for many in America, is this idea of critiquing whiteness. And it is important to understand the foundation of critical theory as the root cause of white anxiety, anger, and backlash against critical race theory. Again, remembering that the fundamental assumption is that all meaning and value within society is socially constructed, and it's socially constructed by and for the benefits of those in power. So to be clear, it is inevitable that when looking at race from a critical perspective in the United States, you are going to critique white supremacy and white dominance of American systems throughout American history. It's inevitable. And it's an important component of that. You can't understand how the African American identity has been shaped and evolved through American history without understanding how white dominance of every system in the country, all the way back to and including the systems of slavery, have fundamentally shaped and developed both the concept of white and black in this country, as well as the discriminatory frameworks that have existed for generations between the two groups. From a practical perspective, and why it's led so many states to begin trying to pass laws, for instance, to keep critical race theory out of the schools. What it means is rewriting American history. What it means is beginning with an argument that race and racism was a much more essential component to not just the development of American history, but its evolution through the various stages that really comprise those moments in which the African American identity, the white identity, the national identity was shaped by the policies and actions of the country and its individual members. So whether we're talking about the Civil War, the writing of the Constitution, World War II, or Vietnam, the reality is that critical race theory would like to reopen the books, so to speak, and take a much closer look at how race and racism in particular impacted the roles and values of those roles, especially of African Americans who were being excluded and victims of that discrimination. As that is a focus, the other reality here is that it's going to expose what we now understand as the concept of white privilege. In other words, the outcomes, the benefits of the long term shaping of those narratives and the systems, the economic, legal, political, and social systems that underpinned the narrative that ultimately was the definition of black and white and continues to be the definition of black and white in America. Exposing white privilege through American history is not an attack on the white identity. It is a clear attempt to first more clearly create and understand the black identity within the context of an American society dominated by white Americans. But it's also an attempt to understand how the inequality within those systems resulting from discrimination and racist narratives created a system of white privilege at the very same time that it created a system of inequality and underdevelopment for African Americans. One of the components of not just looking at white privilege, the outcomes of these systems, but the deeper rewriting and reexamination of history is what has come to be called intersectionality. In other words, African Americans are not the only victims of the development and application of definitions of race within America as a form of discrimination. It is applied to women, it is applied to Native Americans, it is applied to immigrants, Latino Americans, homosexuality. It has impacted just about every corner of American society in which there was a minority group that in one way or another was being discriminated against through the system because of the shaping of a narrative regarding who they were and why their identity ultimately meant they should receive less from the American system. And so in the end, a lot of people are threatened because one of the outcomes of the entire search of critical race theory is the question of white guilt and national responsibility. What exactly was done, who's responsible, and what can be done to mitigate or make up for the damage of generation upon generation of discrimination and racist narratives heaped upon a group that we now know to be immoral, to be illegal. I mean, the words really escape me to a degree. And so it's important to understand that to a certain degree, we're not trying to redefine some absolute truth. Critical theory isn't out there to try and break up what is a fundamental truth that everyone understands. We're not the flat earthers of the race debate. What we are is ultimately people who really want to look deeper into what we've always been taught was the history of our country, to understand how much that history may have actually glossed over decisions and repercussions of decisions that really to this day explain why perhaps people, myself and people that look like me, don't have everything in this society that we fairly should. So when we talk about the ramifications of critical race theory, again, I'm an equal to opportunity pain in a button, so I like to kind of tick off most people, both sides of the aisle here. And so it's important, at least from my perspective, to understand that there are some pitfalls with the critical race theory approach in the same way that there are pitfalls of critical theory when it is being pushed up against your mainstream theories like realism and liberalism. So what are the pitfalls? First, if I agree there is no objective way to define meaning, there is no way to objectively define value so that everyone agrees, then how do we define meaning? How do we know anything's valuable? How do we really operate in society? It's one of the key paradoxes of critical theory is that I do believe they are correct in arguing that all things are impacted by human bias, especially the creation of identifiers that we use to then value ourselves relative to others. But at the same exact time, if I then offer an alternative value, for instance, an alternative definition of Black or African American or American history, I must understand that I'm walking a narrow line where, in fact, I might begin using the very same psychologies and methodologies that I have already identified as being critically flawed. Another issue for the or pitfall for critical theory is that as much as everyone, most observers, even casual observers of critical theory, like and are sympathetic with its arguments about social construction, just because something is not an observable fact doesn't mean it's still not true in the sense of impacting a society. So, for instance, I like to use the analogy of Santa Claus. At a certain age, we all become aware of the fact that Santa Claus doesn't exist. But the concept of Santa Claus absolutely impacts our lives, especially if you have young children, from about mid November to the end of December. And so, although there might be a common understanding like something like race is not a fact, it continues to directly influence and inform how we operate with each other, how we understand ourselves within society, and frankly, how we continue to shape our society moving forward. And I think one of the pitfalls of critical race theory in particular is trying to avoid replacing one superiority with another. If ultimately all we're doing with Black identity through the development of critical race identity is switching which race we believe to be superior, then in the end, we are not accomplishing anything. But at the same time, it is a really difficult task to maintain a narrative of true equality and not try and replace superiority with another when one group continues to espouse superiority as their primary psychology. And so that's going to be the real test for critical race theory in particular, is not becoming its own elitist form. If whites have defined black, how much of blacks help define white? It's important to understand that if critical race theory is correct in the social construction of racial identity, then it's important at some point we begin to look at what role blacks and whites and politics or whatever other concept has played in defining what we understand to be white in America. My own experience is that white more often than not has been defined through socioeconomic characteristics, while they continue while our society continues to try and use ethnic and racial concepts to define black, and so that's a dynamic there that's going to continue to impact um, how much critical race theory in particular is able to influence our understandings of where we are in race and society. And then finally, a key question to ask here is what role have blacks played in defining black? I like to tell my students that the day after racism ends in America and there's no such thing anymore as white and black animosity, blacks are going to have to look at themselves and understand what role they've played in defining the concept of black within the American context. It is true that much of blacks' impact on defining our own identity has been in response to white treatment of African Americans within American history. But there's still some key questions, things like colorism. Colorism is something that continues to exist within the African American society today. And I think it's interesting that you can see this dynamic play out as America responds, for instance, to the Meghan Markle episode and her marriage to Prince William in England. And kind of were surprised at the racial undertones in their responses. I wasn't surprised in the least. In fact, I thought they were muted relative to what we might have seen in a similar dynamic 100 years ago in the United States. And so finally, one of the ramifications is that in the end, we're going to have to really discuss this idea of race versus ethnicity. As much as race is really a scientific straw man, the concept of ethnicity is real, and it is important to the African American community to understand who we are and what components and characteristics of identity help us kind of stand out and feel proud of who we are within a society that's not always been proud to have us as part of it. And so I conclude with a thank you, and I hope I have offered a bit more clarification and understanding to what is ultimately a very complex issue in American politics and society today, critical race theory. Please feel free to look up my other work at medium.com at drillbit.news. And if you have any questions personally for me, please feel free to reach out at dariusewatson at gmail.com. Thank you, and I wish you all a peaceful evening.